Good day. I'm very pleased to contribute to this Wolfson Ancient Lives seminar and to tell you a little about my work on object biographies. My title, as you can see, is Artefacts as Actors at Abydos, and my background is as an Egyptologist who worked as a curator at UCL's Petrie Museum over a period of 24 years. The work that I'm going to tell you about relates to my recently submitted dissertation, which was all written during the lockdown for the Master of Studies in Literature and Arts at Oxford Centre for Continuing Education. This part-time two-year degree provides the opportunity to study the literature and arts of three different periods of British history. So it basically goes from the 16th to the early 20th centuries. And its basis is interdisciplinary. It takes place over 4 5-day residences. On the left, you can see the course journal V-Days. And my cohort were responsible for producing this particular volume, which is number 8 in the series. It's available online, so you can look at it afterwards. And in it, every member of the cohort wrote an article teasing out the links between two distinct yet related artefacts. And in my particular case, I chose a dog whistle and a photograph of a Pekingese puppy. My dissertation drew on British imperial history, material culture studies, and English poetry. The methodology that I used was that of object biographies, for which I used actor network theory as the main method and post-colonial theory, in particular Barber's third space, as a secondary method. My rationale for using ANT was that this sociological theory contains not merely people as human actors, but lays stress on material agency by extending its remit to objects as non-human actors. The latter are viewed as equally important to a social network where all function as heterogeneous actors operating within the same boundaries. Power lies not with the individual, but through their associations. I was particularly interested in testing anthropologist Tim Ingold's expansion of the potential of Littorian networks. So in 2008, Ingold described or defined Littorian networks as, quote, an assemblage of heterogeneous bits and pieces in favour of his own concept of meshworks. So a meshwork, Ingold defined as a tangle of threads and pathways, end of quote. And my aim was to use the stories of inanimate actors to deconstruct the relationships between animate social networks, operating at both a micro and a macro level in Egypt and Britain around 1900. And this leads to my research question. Here you can see my research question. What was the contribution of UCL, University College London, to social networks involved in anthropometry in Egypt and in Britain around 1900? So the key word anthropometry, the late Victorian science of systematically measuring the human body. And I'll now tell you a bit about how this worked. Anthropometry was first popularised by the laboratory which was set up by Francis Galton at the International Health Exhibition in the grounds of the South Kensington Museum in 1884. You can see the laboratory on the left, and on the right we have a poster advertising it. A remarkable total of 9,337 visitors, each paid threepence to have their height, weight, strength, hearing and vision measured with a wide range of Galton's inventions. And they were able to receive a takeaway copy of their test results. On the left, you can perhaps make out some of those strange instruments. The measurements were then used by Galton to promote the eugenic ideal of breeding a utopian race, assuming that the perfect material for doing so were certain white people. A year earlier, in 1883, he had invented the term eugenics, and he defined this as the breeding of what he called human stock to give, quote, the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. And this, of course, was the most dominant and best known strain of eugenics. It is to the human actors that I'm first going to turn, people such as Francis Galton. In the 1909 photograph on the left, you can see the elderly Galton seated with his protege, Karl Pearson. And on the right, we have the Egyptologist Flinders Petrie in a photograph of 1892. As a professional scientist, Galton founded the Eugenics Record Office at what was then University College in 1904. And by 1907, so 3 years later, it became the Francis Galton Laboratory of National Eugenics under the direction of Pearson. So a quote here about the Galton Laboratory: it represented the principal source of authoritative eugenic science, the scientific benchmark of all eugenic discussion in England. The younger men both held UCL professorships. Statistician Pearson had been appointed to the Goldsmith Chair of Applied Mathematics and Mechanics in 1884, and Egyptologist Petrie to the Edwards Chair in Egyptian Archaeology and Philology in 1892, the date of that photograph. And Petrie was deeply involved in eugenic research with Galton and Pearson. My dissertation was very topical. In December 2018, UCL initiated a commission of inquiry into its eugenic history. In July the following year, 2019, I attended the first in what were a series of focus groups facilitated by the Commission. Their aim was to collect data on the opinions, beliefs and ideas of a representative range of the campus community in relation to eugenics and its links to the history of UCL. And not surprisingly, I also managed to subsequently attend the release of the Commission of Inquiry's report, which was on the 28th of February 2020. In June 2020, as a result of the report, UCL started to dename, and that's its UCL's term, commemorative structures associated with Galton and Pearson from around its campus. For example, the Galton Lecture Theatre in the Roberts Engineering Building and the Pearson Building, which is the Geography Building on Gower Street. The museum, named after Petrie, where I once worked, is doubtless likely to follow suit. The traffic symbol, which I put up on the right, sums up the fact that there were actually 2 reports because 9 members of the 16-strong inquiry team refused to sign the original report, which they did not believe had gone far enough. And they distributed an alternative set of recommendations at the 28th of February launch. There's plenty online about this if you want to pursue what actually happened in more detail. We now move to the 2 physical anthropologists who became leading actors in my dissertation. The first is the man here, leading British psychologist William Rivers. And it's not a mistake, he actually had a middle name Rivers and a surname. Actually, the fault of his father, who was an Anglican clergyman and baptized him. Rivers had been teaching experimental psychology at UCL since 1892. And the reason why he poses against a background of coloured walls will become evident as we move the story on. The second anthropologist is Charles Myers. He was a physician and a psychologist, and Rivers had been his Cambridge tutor. Myers is famous because in 1915 he would introduce the term shell shock into the medical literature. And the reason why I have juxtaposed a head spanner from the Galton laboratory will become clear as we move on. These men had been part of the Cambridge Anthropological expedition to the Torres Straits in 1898. We can see in this photograph Rivers, so here he is in the second row here, and Myers is at the back in the centre of the third row, and we can also see here somebody who's going to become important in our story. This is Anthony Wilkin, and he, as you see, he's a young man and he's the one smoking a pipe. Having failed to obtain a job as a correspondent in the Boer War, Wilkin was in 1900 engaged as one of Petrie's assistants at Abydos, and he had joint responsibility for supervising the nearby excavations at the site of El Amra. Here you can see Petrie himself photographing in the courtyard of the Abydos dig house. When booking his passage to Egypt in 1899, Galton happened to encounter his friend Flinders Petrie on the same errand. And Petrie immediately invited Galton, who was going to be travelling with his great niece and companion Eva Biggs, to his current dig. And the week that they spent at Abydos, so that was from the beginning of January, the 5th of January 1900, turned out, according to Galton, to be one of the most interesting experiences of our lives. And in the centre, you can see the crayon sketch, which Eva, obviously on the right, produced of her great uncle in later life. And then on the far left, you see the two of them together. Charles Myers also visited Abydos later in 1900. And this grainy photograph, which was previously completely unattributed, is housed in the archives of the Egypt Exploration Society in London. It obviously shows two Europeans surrounded by an orderly display of dislocated skeletons in an area of desert. And judging by the palm tree that you've got at the back here, it was close to the dig house. So we've got Myers seated on the left, and his hands are resting on a wooden crate that substitutes for his examination table. And perched on the crate is his friend Wilkin to the right. There is added poignancy to this photograph, which I've enlarged here, because this may be the very last surviving image of Wilkin. And as a photographer, he was normally positioned behind the camera. So by May 1900, aged just 23, Wilkin would be dead from dysentery in Cairo. We are now going to turn to the inanimate actors who functioned as star players in my dissertation. Firstly, a map. Galton has annotated his map, as you can see in purple ink, and Abydos here is highlighted as where Flinders Petrie is. And a large X is marking Luxor, to which he returned after what he said was the very rough, quote, excavation life. So he went back here to the creature comforts of the Karnak Hotel. And this map, shown here in its entirety, functioned very much as a colonial tool in Galton's travels. I devoted some space in my dissertation to analysing this watercolour by the pre-Raphaelite painter Henry Wallis. So Flinders Petrie admiring a find at the Ramesseum in 1895. It's now housed in the Petrie Museum, and I compare it with a black and white photograph. Here then is the photograph, which is housed in the archives of the Egypt Exploration Society, Petrie and his fellaheen workmen at Abydos in 1901. So what we're going to do now is to juxtapose these two images and attempt an analysis. In both images, Petrie, as the colonialist, stands at a higher elevation relative to the fellaheen. In the watercolour, this is marginal, but in the photograph, as you can see, it becomes considerably more pronounced owing to the depth of the excavations. Petrie's pose as an art connoisseur in the painting has more to tell us about Wallis as a collector of antiquities and a ceramics expert, and it can be contrasted with his more naturalistic photographic stance. The objects studied have become objectified and lie at Petrie's feet. Most importantly, the inscribed pot that he clutches precariously by its base holds dramatically at arm's length, and on which he fixes his admiring gaze denotes that it is only Western knowledge that can read the inscription and as a result ascribe the vessel to its correct epoch. With the blurring of human and object categories, we remain uncertain as to whether it is Petrie or the vase which is the subject of the painting. And there is continuing uncertainty as to who are the subject and objects of the image when turning to the fellaheen, so that is the Egyptian agricultural labourers. The vase appears to have been framed to possess a deeper humanity than the people who have been objectified. Wallis is depicting them in a similar fashion to the things being studied, so that is as an indistinguishable collective. And I hope you agree that he leaves us with a triangle: local population, artifacts, and foreigners. Let's turn now to the fellaheen. In the painting, look for the older fella in blue clothing, the one who's crouched at Petrie's feet. And then we've got younger men, we've got youths, and we've got boys. If we turn to the photograph, we can see here that because of the nature of their task, the 4 basket carriers are likely to be youths, and that's confirmed by the facial features of the fella on the far left. And we've got an older overseer who's standing directly behind him. And this ties in with Petrie's assertion that, quote, the best age for diggers is about 15 to 20 years. After that, many turn stupid, end of quote. Petrie additionally deemed body size an important selection criteria. And he said, quote, the best workers are the scraggy, undersized youths, end of quote. And the camera is confirming their back-breaking labour. So we've got a worker whose face is obscured by his loaded basket. And we've got the 2 to the right who have been captured as they stride. And the one who's nearest to Petrie's feet is bending. In direct contrast to this dirt archaeology is the passivity of the fellaheen who gather around to admire Petrie in the watercolour. Framed by Wallis as the Western observer, the fellaheen have definitely not been explained on their own terms. By contrast, the youths in the photograph are fully clothed in traditional galabeers, reflecting everyday dig life, unlike the lack of clothing in the painting. What the painting and the photograph do agree on is capturing Petrie's position of control, which was both symbolic and factual. So what I want you to look at is his long staff. So this emphasizes his paternalistic authority. He grasps the long staff in his right hand in both images. And this personifies his statement that, quote, engagement, dismissal, and the money bag are all in my hands, end of quote. And I hope that this juxtaposition of images has given an inkling of what you can do when you compare and contrast two different artworks, as it were. So the image is work seamlessly together. And we can discuss that in the questions and answers. The quote here, in the quadrangle sat Rivers in his short sleeves and flannels, just as in the old Murray Island times, with a native intent on colourful walls before him. This was written by Myers in relation to his 5-hour visit to the site, which we recently saw evidence of in the photograph. On the left, we have Rivers, and here he actually is in the Murray Islands during the 1898 expedition to the Torres Straits, and he is using here a colour wheel. Rivers was also at Abydos in December 1900, and he was conducting colour vision experiments on Petrie's workforce. Petrie was deliberately encouraging anthropometric experiments on his workmen during this period. On the right, we have an artefact called Holmgren's Walls. It's a device invented in Sweden in 1876 in the wake of a fatal train crash. And it was used to test railwaymen and seamen for colour blindness. The misreading of red and green signals was a major 19th century safety issue, which rapidly became a political issue, which I do explore in my dissertation. Here we have the inventor, Holmgren, on the left, and I'm now going to explain to you how this simple and what was a highly transportable wall test worked. It basically required the subject to match 3 different test walls, and you see them here. We've got pale green, pale rose in the middle, and bright red. And there's a whole number of additional walls piled inside the box. Some of them are match colours and some were there to create confusion, so confusion colours. In the first stage, the subject had to correctly pick the same colour rather than the shade of green to demonstrate that they were not colour blind. The second stage, if they were colourblind, was to use the rose and the red test walls to identify the actual type of colour blindness. In total, Rivers tested 80 men and boys from Petrie's 130-strong workforce. One of the aims of my dissertation was to keep at the forefront those affected by anthropometric experiments. So in this way, what I was doing aligned with the Black Lives Matter debate in our contemporary world. And hopefully I achieved this idea of giving voice to the fellaheen by unpicking the case of one particular workman. So he is the workman Erfai, and if you just look at a photograph, this is not Erfai himself, but just imagine that he is. It's a photograph of around the same date, 1899. Now, this workman matched Holmgren's green test with brownish and pinkish walls. He matched the rose with violets and blues and the red with browns and greens. And as a result, Rivers pronounced him, quote, certainly colourblind and of the red-green type. However, these groupings make absolutely perfect sense when we consider the colours that this Egyptian was surrounded by in his desert environment. And this implies, in turn, that a serious cultural misunderstanding had taken place. And it's pretty obvious that Rivers' lack of Arabic meant that he was unable to explain the principles of the test to his subjects. Here we have Karl Pearson's prototype head spanner. It was designed by him and it was then produced in considerable numbers for use in 200 schools all across the United Kingdom, which had volunteered to take part into Pearson's investigation into the inheritance of mental and moral character traits in pairs of siblings between the ages of 10 and 14. And his head spanners were responsible for gleaning data from about 1,000 British families over a 5-year period. Charles Myers used a solitary example of a Pearson head spanner to single-handedly measure 1,006 Egyptian conscripts in just 4 months. And he recalls that Wingate had, quote, very kindly placed at my disposal as many Egyptian and Sudanese troops as I could examine during my visit. Aged between 18 and 25, these troops were quartered at Abydos, then a suburb of Cairo. And Myers later travelled to the Sudan, where he spent 6 weeks measuring 189 Sudanese soldiers based at Khartoum and Omdurman. In total, he took 17,000 separate measurements, together with 200 full-face and profile photographs. I also discovered that he was taking measurements from the unclaimed bodies of convicts in the Cairo Medical School. These hierarchies applied in the British as well as in the colonial context. We have child siblings, fellaheen conscripts, and abandoned corpses, all equally voiceless. All were forced to undergo head measurements. The spanner would have been painfully locked around their heads, regardless of their consent. Just to show you how the head spanner worked, on the left you can see in Hislop, who's trying to measure his own head using Pearson's head spanner. Well, at least he was wearing gloves to do so. And on the right, in a photograph from about 1910, you can see the traditional employment. The head spanner would have been employed by Myers once each soldier had been subjected to having his face marked out in blue pencil. And its accuracy very much depended on force because it needed to come as close to the bone as possible. And as a result, it was an instrument that would have inevitably caused pain both to those convicts and to the British school children. Pearson and Myers were both additionally recording eye colour and the colour and texture of hair, and Myers additionally recorded and assessed skin colour. We now come to the answer to my research question. I discovered that UCL was an important power broker, an academic power broker at this period in both Egypt and Britain. And I viewed this in terms of its eugenicists. So Galton as the doyen of anthropometry, Pearson as the gatekeeper to his publication Biometrica, which was issued out of UCL, and Petrie as the gatekeeper to his Abydos excavations. And this is where third space came in. So you might want to ask me that when we come to the questions. During the First World War, Rivers, who you see on the right, famously treated the man on the left, who I am sure many of you will recognise as the poet Sigrid Sassoon, for shell shock. We end here with the poem by Sassoon to a very wise man. It's one of the poems he dedicated to Rivers. And here we have the text on the right in his own hand. I picked out two lines from it. They're these two lines in the first stanza. Your soul is full of cities with dead names and blind-faced earthbound gods of bronze and stone. And these lines show how the poet was intrigued by his psychiatrist Rivers as an erstwhile anthropologist. By contrast, my research argues that the anthropometric team failed to seize the opportunity to enter into a more complex cultural communication with the Egyptian workforce. Capable of serious cultural misunderstandings and errors of judgment, Rivers was in fact unwise. Another result of my research is that by applying post-colonial theory to the object biographies, I afforded some kind of voice, as I hope I've been able to show you, to those ordinary people targeted by anthropometric experiments and eugenic policies. Finally, and most important, I was able to flatten ANT's networks into Ingold's meshworks, so that tangle of threads and pathways all became interconnected in a fascinating way. Finally, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention to this presentation, and I'm looking forward to being with you on Wednesday the 28th and to answering your questions then and discussing this with you. Thank you very much.